Hello, everyone, and welcome to this live presentation titled OPC to SQL. My name is Randy, and I'm the presenter today. We have already verified that most of you can receive the audio portion of this webinar well. So if you have a problem with the audio, please let me know immediately. We will provide a copy of this webinar at the end of the presentation. In today's webinar, we're going to cover the data custody transfer problem. We'll talk about how to capture real-time OPC data using OPC Classic and OPC UA, so OPC DA and OPC UA. We'll talk about recording this for long-term historical data and event-based information capture. So, for example, some of you are doing testing, and you need test results, but not the result before the tests are done. So we'll talk about that as well. And optional data storage alternatives using a CSV or XML, just in case SQL might not be the right thing for you. And at the very end, we'll talk about how to get the webinar recording. So yes, you will get the webinar recording. Okay, so data transfer, data custody transfer. It turns out that IT often uses Microsoft's SQL Server to store data. They're using it to get data to their web servers, to Microsoft Office applications, to their custom applications, to send information to the internet. They're using SQL Server a lot. So that's up here, and this is where IT is. Well, automation is usually down here with OPC servers. So we're using OPC a lot, actually, to send data to and from controllers, applications. OPC is all over the place in manufacturing. And what we need to do is to capture real-time data in SQL Server using OPC DA or using OPC UA, whatever. The only question is how exactly do you get this done? Well, we're going to talk about this OPC Expert, which is the middleware we're going to be covering here. Now, in previous webinars, we already covered OPC to Excel. We showed you how to use this as middleware for getting data into Excel, or for tunneling, or for trending, or for server-to-server communication. So we've seen that already. In this case, we're talking about getting the data to Microsoft SQL Server, because what SQL Server needs, and those of you that have been in our training or those that have read up on OPC know that SQL Server needs an OPC client in order to be able to connect to OPC servers. So it needs a client to connect to the servers, and that's the part that this middleware performs. So it's got tables, there's a database, tables it dumps data into, and I'll show you all that and how it actually works. And this is really a tool to join IT and automation together. So let's take a look. What is it that we require from such a connection, whether it's OPC Expert or whatever else you have? Number one is to reduce the file size. We don't want SQL Server to get too big. For example, if we're looking at a temperature and the temperature is 70 degrees, should it be 70, 70, 70, 70? Oh, 71, 72, 72, 72, 72. Do we want this data like that? Well, no. What we want to be able to do is to reduce the amount of space that we use and only store it on data change or report by exception, which in OPC is called a subscription. So that's how that's handled. And handle problems. We need this thing to handle problems. For example, what happens when there's software problems? What happens when SQL Server goes away? What happens when the OPC server goes away? How do we recover? How to recover from computer and network failures? A computer might fail, network connection might fail. How do we prevent data loss? It has to prevent data loss using store and forward mechanisms or redundancy. So that's what this thing needs to be able to do. And of course, we typically want these things to run as a Windows service. So it can run unattended without anybody being there. It needs to be managed by Windows and automatically start up. So we've got the reliability. Also, security is a big issue. It's a really big issue. We need to make sure that we have secure communication. So we really need to respect SQL Server security right up here. using Microsoft SQL Server security, also Windows security. We also need to respect OPC server protection, whether it's OPC security or Windows security. We need to respect the ability to make sure that all the communication is encrypted so nobody can eavesdrop and go through firewall. So all of that needs to be respected, and it needs to work properly and done by people who are not necessarily IT people. And I'll show you how that's done. So we'll do a little demo to show how that's actually done. Now, the architecture itself. So this is what it's going to look like. So we've got a couple of OPC servers here, whether they're UA or DA, you shouldn't really have to care. That goes into OPC Expert. From there, the data goes into SQL Server. So that's what we're really talking about. And that's really where we end, because from SQL Server, IT is already pulling information into all sorts of applications, as I said earlier, into Microsoft Office, into custom or bespoke applications, onto the internet, onto computers or laptops or your phones or wherever these things are. We need to get the data in there, and that's what IT is doing for us. The only problem, again, is how do you get the data into SQL Server? So IT is usually very comfortable. Once the data is in here, how do they get it out? The question is, how do you bring it in? And that's what we're talking about here. So we'll do, we're also talking about, well, okay, if I don't send data to SQL Server, maybe I want to put it into CSVs or into XML files, but whatever. How exactly do we get this done? And we'll do a demo to show how this works. So that's a demo I'll show you. And folks, please keep your questions coming. I've already answered a few of your questions. For those that ask questions, as we do the demo, go ahead and ask, and I will reply to the questions. Okay, so let's take a look at a demo here. Now, what I've done is I've set up a computer here. So there's Microsoft SQL Server installed. It's actually SQL Server 2019 using Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio 18. There is OPC Expert. And just to show you, we'll open the file location. And there's OPC Expert. When you download OPC Expert, you really just get one executable, and then it actually extracts everything it needs to on its own. So I'll show you what's going on here. When I start this, so here, I'll start it over here. You can see that files, okay, there you go. You can see that files were extracted already. OPC Expert did that. So the files are already out, and there is OPC Expert running. So there we go. So OPC Expert is running. We'll go View, Server. So everything I'm looking at here is all the default installation. So we need to tell it to look at Microsoft SQL Server databases. Now, I'll give you a link at the very end to show you where you can download OPC Expert from. But you'll actually see how this browsing works, and everything that I'm showing you is available if you just download it from the website. So you see immediately OPC Expert found two OPC DA servers. They are in the blue. So that's DA and DA. We see a DA server from Kepware and a DA server from Iconics. Both of these companies make OPC servers. And we can see that we can get to their data just to the server, that is, just like that. There are also two OPC UA servers. You can see that in turquoise. It says OPC UA and OPC UA. One's from Kepware, one's from OPC Expert. And we see our SQL database right there. So OPC Expert automatically finds it. So we're going to connect to Kepware's UA server. So we'll connect to it right here. And in previous webinars, we showed you how to get data and how to do data conversions, but we can see data is coming in. Just I'll make it a little bit smaller in just a moment, just so you can see. So we're getting data from OPC DA, and here's another way to get data. So here we go. So we're getting data right here. And just make this smaller so you can see what kind of information you get. Don't need this. Okay, so what we see here is that we're getting the item ID. You can see the item IDs are different depending on the OPC servers. You can expand this. So you can see it's different. The item names, the values, timestamps, the quality, it's all good right now. We're getting data once a second right now, and you can see the data types. The data types are coming in. So I didn't archive this yet. We're looking at real-time data. So now we acquired real-time data from an OPC DA server, that's this guy right here, and an OPC UA server. You can connect as many as you want, locally or remote. Okay, now I'm going to select all these items. So I'm selecting all these items right here, selecting, right-click, and this time I will archive. So since we're doing Microsoft SQL Server, that's where I want to store it. And I'll click Next. Here you go. So we can see that it automatically finds SQL PC. That's a server. It's going to dump the data into a database called Expert. You can, of course, change that. I'm not going to, just because I'll just use the defaults here. It's nice and easy. You can manage your file growth or your maximum file size. All nice and easy. There's the table format, the timestamps. Now notice the timestamps are going to be recorded in UTC. This here is my local time. So my local time is 12 minutes past 11 a.m. I'm on Mountain Time. Yours is different, obviously, but we're going to store the time in UTC, which I'll point out right away. So anyway, there we go. I'll click OK. And take a look. You'll see these X's. There we go. You see X's, and now they're check marks. So everything is now set up properly, and we're sending data to SQL Server right now as we are speaking. I'll just let this thing build up a bit so it'll be a bit more interesting. So there we are. We can see we're getting the data. OPC Expert shows you the real-time data. This is the OPC Expert folder. And data is going into SQL Server. So let's take a look at the data in SQL Server. And to do that, we use Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio. It's version 18.4. It's the latest. It comes with SQL Server 2019. And we even have a video on how to set this up. So if you need to set up SQL Server, we've got something showing you exactly how to set it up. So there we go. So when we go into databases, so all of this is by default with SQL Server. OPC Expert added this one right here. So it added this. Here are the tables. And let's take a look at what we have in the tables. Now, in the main table, this, and we'll select the top 1,000 rows, we can see that we've got 744 rows. And now we have 782 rows and 820 rows. So it's growing, and we're getting the data right now. This is all the history data. Notice the timestamp here. This isn't my time. My time is 11. It's 12 past 11, but it's showing 1700 because this time is in UTC. I'll execute again. Now keep in mind 987 rows. I only asked for the top 1,000. So when I execute again, I'll be stuck at 1,000. So there I am. I'm stuck at 1,000. So I'll say, no, actually, I want the top 10,000 rows. We'll execute, and we can see we have 1,100 rows, and this is constantly growing. Why? Because we're storing all of this in SQL Server. So you can see the historical data, and you can go back, and you can take a look at all of the data. Now, keep in mind, this looks like Excel. It looks like you can get dynamic outputs here, but it's not by default. So if you're used to Excel, we have to constantly refresh. Now, if you want to look at the real-time data, there's a second table right here. So those that understand SQL Server know exactly how to get this done. But there you go. You can see that we have a total of 12 rows because I archived. I chose 12 items to archive. You can see their names, their values. This is the latest value. You can also see the path, quality, and so on. But what you see is this is the value that was obtained at 10 minutes and 47 seconds past the hour, 1700 UTC. If I execute again, you can see this changes. So this table is constantly being updated. You can see turbidity is 7.75. In fact, let's look at pencils. Pencils is 10.1027, and now it's 1069 and 1079. So it's constantly changing every time we update. But this table here is just a real-time table. So if somebody in IT needs to get the latest value, they don't have to go to the bottom of any table. They can just look here. It makes it really, really easy. But if they want to look at historical values, they go to this table, that's this main table, and that's where they see the number of rows. So, pardon me, they can see all the historical data. You can see we already collected 1,300 rows. That was the last time we looked, but it's been a few seconds. And now we are at 2,265 rows. So this is constantly growing. And of course, in OPC Expert, you can put a limit on this. You can make it a FIFO queue, or a circular buffer, so it keeps on going. You notice that the data is only stored when it changes. For example, you can see memory. So memory right here is something that isn't changing. And as a result, we don't see it anywhere here. When we go down, we don't see it anywhere because it didn't change. But when we take a look, so if I go, rename like, oh, we want single quotes. Boom. Okay, execute. So now we're only looking at turbidity. You can see 297 rows. This value changes every second, 17, 12, and 49 seconds, 50 seconds, 51, 59, and then it goes back. So you can see it changes every second. Is what's happening here. So this item here changes every second. So we see updates every second. If we take a look, for example, at pencils, pencils also changes every second, but I know nails does not. There you can see nails, 48, 50, 52, 54, 56, 58. So it's changing once every 2 seconds. And the timestamp here, by the way, comes from the OPC server, meaning OPC Expert doesn't put on its own, doesn't call its own timestamp. Now, a demo, you're asking, can you use stored procedures? Yes, absolutely. You can, and you can really modify this quite nicely. So yes, you can. A demo. Yeah, excellent. So you can see now what I wanted to show you as well is message. Five. Oh, wrong one. I'll show you note. And here is the note. Now you can see that we're storing data once every second, only where it changes. So there we go. Oh yeah, we didn't have something called message. It was called memory. F5. And you can see there's only one in here. If I go to OPC, and there's only one because it hasn't changed. It's a set point, it just hasn't changed. So it's not archived again. And that's what prevents your database from becoming absolutely massive, because otherwise you'd store 3.14, 3.14, 3.14 every second. And we obviously do not want to do that. Folks, please keep your questions coming. I've already answered quite a few as we went along. Okay. Oh, I just want to move this down a bit. Here we go. There's OPC Expert right behind here, and we can see that we are getting data. So here, what we saw is that we connected to an OPC DA server and UA server, and those were going into OPC Expert, and that goes into SQL Server. So, John, what you're asking is, would there be another record for memory if the quality changes? Yes, absolutely. If there's a record every time there's a change, and the change can be either a value, quality, or a timestamp. It just so happens that the timestamp didn't change at all from the OPC server. So that's why there's no change. If the quality changed, yes, you would, of course, record it. In that way, you would know that you had bad quality at some point, which, of course, is necessary to make sure that that you can trend right and you can see your data properly. So we've got OPC UA, OPC DA going in here and going to SQL Server. And what we saw is that this was changing. Now, I'm going to go through just a few slides here just to end the formal portion of this webinar. Then I'll go back to your questions so you can ask and we'll see what's available. So for automated troubleshooting, what have we got here? Well, there's OPC Rescue that you can download. It's free and it will help you to troubleshoot and diagnose, or you can download OPC Expert, which is like OPC Rescue on some serious steroids, where you can view the data and diagnose, which we just saw here. If you download OPC Expert, you're actually going to get bridging in there, which is server-to-server communication, trending. You'll get the archiving, for example, to SQL Server or to CSVs. Tunneling is already in there. Calculations, Excel is in there. You can connect OPC UA and DA servers very, very easily. Does the automated troubleshooting. And of course, in this case, we talked about archiving, and very specifically, we covered archiving to SQL Server. And yes, Jim, we can connect to both, we can save data to both CSVs and SQL Server at the same time. So yes, that absolutely can be done. Okay, so if you want to learn more, you can earn your certified OPC professional designation by coming to one of our hands-on workshops where you learn how to configure DCOM and OPC UA. You learn how to do that to get through firewalls, what ports are needed, what ports are not, how do we get around having to open thousands of ports. We don't want to do that and open thousands of ports. We can get it down to just one port, even with DCOM. How exactly do we configure DCOM for that? What are the requirements? So we take a look at that. So firewall communication, then authentication. How do you set up user accounts for both work groups and domains? Work group to domain communication, domain to work group communication, domain to domain. What happens when you need a domain trust, and so on. So we see all of that. And what permissions do people need? Do you really need to provide administrator access to everybody? Is that really necessary or not? What is necessary? What is not? How do we remove permissions? How do we do authorization as well? So we talked about authentication. How do we do the authorization? How do we get rid of groups? And you've seen this in your DCOM config that you allow everyone, and authenticated users and remote users and system, and on and on and on and on, and network users, DCOM users. The list just goes on. How do you avoid that? How do you clean it all up and make it very secure and very easy to manage? So we cover all of that. And you learn how to properly secure OPC systems and learn OPC best practices. Now, in these workshops, you actually get your own computer. In fact, you get two computers that you configure yourself. So you configure them yourself, you troubleshoot the problems, you fix them, and then once everything is fixed, we actually break it, and then you have to fix it again. So we break, you fix, we break, you fix. It's a cycle, and you really start to understand what's going on with OPC, and again, earn your certified OPC professional designation. Now, where are these workshops? Well, we've got live remote classes, especially now during COVID. There's no travel, so we have live remote classes, and we've been doing these for many years, for actually a lot of years. We've been doing these, delivering them online, so this is not a sudden thing. They're just becoming more popular now. But we have these every month, and you can join one of these workshops. Now, once COVID is under control, and you can come to one of our in-person classes. We've got classes all over the world, literally all over the world, Asia, Europe, North America. We even have classes in South America. If you go to our website, www.opcti.com, you'll actually see a list. And we have both public and private classes. Public classes, anybody can join. Private classes, if you've got enough people in your company, we can do one just for you. Either at on-site, off-site, or even remote, so we can get all of that done for you. Okay, last slide coming up, and then I'll get back to the questions that you were asking. So tomorrow you're going to get an email. Just give us some time to produce this webinar. So you'll get a link to a recording of this webinar. We're going to so you'll get a link to download this webinar. You will also get a link to download OPC Expert, and we have short videos showing you, number one, how to install SQL Server. If you don't have SQL Server, how do you install SQL Server? SQL Server 2017 and 2019. So we show you how to do that. It's in a very, I think it's about a 4-minute video, so quite short. And how to send data from OPC to SQL. So we show you exactly how to do that. So in essence, what I showed you here, but very, very succinct, very quick. You'll also get an invitation to our next webinar titled OPC to Excel. Now, we've done webinars on OPC and Excel before. This is a different twist. So this is next month, and we're talking about Excel, OPC, and very specifically VBA. So I'll show you how to get Excel working with VBA. You'll actually control your own PLC in Excel. So you actually get an Excel Excel connection with a PLC. Really quite neat. So you get to see how that's done, and you'll get your source code. So we'll actually send you the source code for this, and you can get your own visual PLC that you can make in Excel. Really very neat. I highly encourage you to go to it. All right, so that's the end. That's the end of the formal part of this presentation. Let's take a look now. We'll go back to the questions that you were asking. Okay, Erwin. How can I make sure that no data is lost in case of connection between UA server and OPC Expert breaks? Okay, so this is a very good question. So let me go back here. So what we're talking about is reliability. So Ern's question is, what happens when the connection between OPC Expert and the OPC server is gone? Well, there are a couple of ways that you can get that done. Number one, if the OPC server just crashes for whatever reason, obviously you're going to lose data. There's no magic here. You're obviously going to lose data in that situation. That's not what you're asking, though. What you're asking is, what happens if the network connection goes away? So what happens if OPC Expert and the OPC server are on different PCs and the network connection goes away? Well, in that case, you can use the data queue that's built into OPC UA. And this data queue enables you to actually retrieve data that you wouldn't have received if the problem is a network disconnection. So the OPC server can actually queue up the data, and OPC Expert will grab this data, send it to SQL Server. So so that's handled with the data queue, which is handled by the OPC server. Now, next question is, well, what happens if my communication between OPC Expert and the SQL Server PC is gone? Obviously, if these are on the same PC, that's not going to happen. But what if this connection is broken, maybe on the network? Well, in that case, OPC Expert has its own queue, its own buffer, that it will start to queue up all of the data. And when the connection is restored to SQL Server, it sends all of that data over to SQL Server, so you're not losing data. And that's how you take care of reliability. Now, another way you can do this is with redundancy. So if OPC Expert is set up to connect to 2 OPC servers at the same time with redundancy, hot or warm redundancy, cold, whatever, it'll actually do that for you. So that's all done. Erwin, I hope that answers your question. Okay, Eric, you're asking the difference between OPC UA and OPC Classic. Just in general, we're talking about 2 different forms of OPC. They're OPC UA servers, OPC Classic servers, but that difference is made invisible by OPC Expert because it connects to both. If you want to know more about that, though, please let me know. We've got classes very specifically on what that is. Gabriel, will OPC Expert support storing OPC data in time series databases like InfluxDB as opposed to SQL? Short answer is yes, absolutely. Send me that. Well, in fact, I'll reply to you. But yes, in short. If you need it in any kind of format, this is something that we do quite often. And a lot of the features that you're seeing here were built because people very specifically asked for them. So yes, that is very possible at all. Adelmo. In the event of a network outage in between OPC Expert and the database, how is the buffering managed in order not to lose data? So we're talking about the buffering here. So I think you asked that question before I explained, but OPC Expert actually manages all of that data in here. Then it sends to SQL Server. As soon as it sends it to SQL Server, and as soon as it receives confirmation the data actually arrived, OPC Expert gets rid of that data it has, and it's in SQL Server in the format that you need, which is actually very, very nice. So nothing for you to actually handle yourself. What is the maximum scan rate? So in other words, what is the fastest scan rate, Marco? That's what you're asking. And that is 1 millisecond. So in other words, 1,000 times a second is what OPC Expert would allow you. Now, why does OPC Expert allow 1 millisecond? It's because that's what's available in OPC. Now, just keep in mind, even if I'm set up to get data every millisecond, remember, that's 1,000 updates a second. But if the value doesn't change, OPC Expert doesn't send the data over to SQL Server. So it just doesn't do that to make sure that you do not have, that your databases don't get too big for no reason. So for example, if the value is 70, you don't get 70, 70, 70, 70, 70, 70, once every millisecond. In fact, you get 70. And then if an hour later the value changes, boom, you get 71 or whatever that value is. Yoon. OPC Server, Splunk. Can OPC Expert send readings to Splunk? Not quite sure what you mean by Splunk. So just let me know. I don't want to say that it is supported or not. I don't. It might be something I don't really know. I'll take a look at that and I'll reply to you. Main table. Okay, John. Main table is going to get very big. How much data can be stored without any degrading of performance or retrieving data? So I want to point out to everybody, the question is, so there are two questions here. Number one is, how do we limit the size? So let's not talk about performance. The question is, how do we limit the size? I'm going to show you that. So when we go over here, let's go over to OPC Expert. So we'll go back to the PC. You can see we're still storing data. And just to show you here, get rid of this. So we're looking at all the data. And this is what John is talking about. You can see we already have 10,000 rows. That's getting big, right? But it gets much, much, much bigger. So here we can actually see we have 12,000 rows. And if we do this again, we got 12,623. And this thing is constantly growing. So if you leave this for a year, it's going to get pretty massive, like really, really big. It can get very big. So what you want to do is limit the size. Maybe you don't, but maybe you do want to limit the size. So if you do want to limit the size, OPC Expert already has facilities for that, and I'll show you. So for example, if we go in here, when we set up the database, so we'll create a new archive, it has a maximum file size, which by default, it's unrestricted file growth, but you can also restrict it to a certain size. And then it's FIFO, first in, first out, meaning that it just will overwrite that queue. So it won't let it grow bigger than that, than this particular size. It keeps on overwriting. So you may want that, you may not. It's all up to you. So that's how it limits the size in SQL Server. So now the next question is about performance. People always ask this, how many data items can you have? And the answer is OPC Expert does not restrict you at all. OPC Expert does not restrict the number of items that you put in, doesn't restrict the size, unless you tell it, of course. But the limitation is not in OPC Expert. The limitation is in SQL Server. The limitation is in the OPC servers. Keep in mind, there's a limitation in the PC as well. So, for example, if you've got 1 gig of RAM with one processor, and you want to connect to 1,000 different PCs and to 1,000 OPC servers, and each one has 1,000 items, we are going to have a lot of data. And yeah, the hardware will be a limitation, but the performance limitations are not within OPC Expert. So it gets, if you want a better answer than that, you need to give more of specifics of what you're talking about for your limitations. Delmo. Does OPC Expert support clustered installation for HA? So in other words, I think what you're getting at is connecting to multiple servers. So yes, it does connect to multiple servers, but the cluster itself is handled by the HA server. But I think I'll ask you offline very specifically what you're talking about there. Where can I see a calendar of upcoming events like this? Constantine. It's opcti.com, www.opcti.com, opctraininginstitute.com, and you can see all this stuff. And you can also go to opcexpert.com. Jacob. In a redundancy, so he's asking, in a redundancy OPC server setup, will OPC Expert handle data duplication? Yeah, actually. And that's very, very important because both OPC servers will send duplicate data. Well, they better send duplicate data. So in other words, I've got 2 OPC servers. They're connected to the same device, maybe. They will be sending duplicate data. And yes, OPC Expert does handle the duplication and getting rid of the duplication. How does it handle it? In a very clever way. But yes, it does do that for sure. Does OPC always get and store data in real time? So OPC Expert does get real time data, yes. Does it store it if you want it to? Can it retrieve historical data? Yes, it can. So if I answered your question, let me know more specifically. Brett. Oh, Splunk has an IoT software solution. So yeah, we would connect. But we can take a look very, very specifically, Brett. I'll be happy to speak to you about that. Does OPC manage data compression? Abdel Rahim. So does OPC Expert manage data compression? Yes. And this is non-lossy data compression. Non-lossy, if you want to get a little bit more specific. So it does this with a report by exception mechanism. Very, very important. Barry, again, another question of compression. Can data be compressed or eliminated by exception, eliminate changes that are insignificant? Yeah, actually, sorry, Barry, you're talking about something a little bit different here. When you're talking about changes that are insignificant, that's a bit different. In other words, a change that is insignificant is a change. So, for example, you might get data that is 1.001, 1.002, 1.003, 1.001. That is a change, and you might say, that's insignificant. I'm only interested in one decimal place. In other words, 1.0, 1.0, 1.0. So yes, you can do that, and that's handled with a deadband, and that is for sure something that OPC Expert supports, absolutely, and that eliminates a whole bunch of data. Chris, for RealTime Table, if the value doesn't change, does the timestamp still change? So, does the timestamp still change? And I'll show you. Let's go back here. Let's take a look at the RealTime Table. This is the RealTime Table. This is the value that didn't change. Remember, this is a value that didn't change. Memory. It didn't change. And you can see that it's still at 10 minutes and 47 seconds. So right now it's way after that. If I execute this again, remember, it still hasn't changed. So no, you don't get, this does not change, right? Now, if the OPC server tells us, hey, wait a minute, I've got a new timestamp, then yeah, of course, that'll be reflected here. That's for sure, because that's a change by the OPC server. But otherwise, so even if you're in disconnected mode, as long as the timestamp doesn't change, it might actually go to bad and then might go back to good again. So for sure. So this is done as you would expect it, Chris. Constantine, so last question here. Is OPC Expert 64-bit? So the interesting thing here is, are we talking about 64-bit or 32-bit? So the interesting thing is whether you are, OPC Expert is 32-bit. However, it will connect just easily to 64-bit OPC servers, to 32-bit OPC servers, 64, 32, and it will provide data to 64 and 32-bit applications. So it doesn't actually limit you. Very, very important. We decided to do that, to go with 32-bit, because still not all systems are 32-bit. Those are the 64-bit. We'll connect to this just fine, and the speed is isn't limited. Jim, your question is testing data. Okay, so this is a very interesting one. So testing data, so the issue is, when you have, suppose you're doing a test, and that test is, I'm getting some real-time data, but my test isn't done, but all I want to store is my test results. So for example, I'm putting my pressure goes up, and I'm looking for failure, and I want to record just the failure information. So my pressure goes up, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, boom, it fails at 6. Okay, so great, I got it at 6, and when there was a failure, the temperature was 184 degrees, and the pressure was 6, whatever units you want, and that's what I want to store. So yeah, in OPC Expert, you can set your own trigger to say, okay, now I want to store my data. In other words, I don't want to store it on data change, but rather I want to store it based on an external event. And yes, you can absolutely do that. So so for example, if you did 10 tests, you will only have 10 lines actually being stored. Not if those 10 tests took 2 hours, you wouldn't get 2 hours worth of data. Rather, you just get those 10 lines, 1 per test. So yes, you can do that right out of the box with OPC Expert. Brett, OPC Expert, max socket connection, limited by the OS. Yeah, absolutely. The operating system is what's limiting OPC Expert, and we'll use whatever sockets you want. Adelmo. Does OPC Expert support encryption connections to SQL Server? Absolutely. But moreover, not just encrypted connections to SQL Server. We'll make this one the last question here. So not just encrypted connections to SQL Server. So not just this being encrypted, but also this being encrypted or not. So you can make them encrypted, or you can make them in plain text, whichever one you want. Depends on your system requirements. So that's what there is for that. Okay, folks. Looks like we are out of time. We're right at 45 after. I will just show you the very last slide just to remind you. Tomorrow you're going to get an email with a link to this webinar recording, this very specific webinar. You'll get a link from where you can download OPC Expert and some videos showing you how to install SQL Server if you don't have it. Forgot to mention, this works both with SQL Express, non-licensed, the free version, and also the licensed version of SQL. It doesn't really matter. So if you haven't already, you can skip this video and move over to this one where we show you how to use OPC Expert to store data in SQL Server. You'll also get a link to the next webinar titled OPC to Excel, which will be on July 9. So in just about 3 weeks, I guess. We're talking about Excel, OPC, and very specifically VBA. We'll show you how to do your own PLC. You'll get some source code that you can use and have your own PLC. Really quite neat. This is a webinar I don't think you've ever seen but by any company, but we will see what's going on and how that's done. In any case, everyone, I hope you found this valuable. I hope to see you at the next webinar, OPC to Excel. Until then, if anybody has any questions, please write them, send them over. We'll answer them, and I hope to see you at our next webinar. Thanks again, everybody. Bye-bye.